The students, faculty, and administration of Augsburg College, it is indeed a pleasure to welcome you to the campus this evening and to this public lecture. As you already know, the lecture this evening is part of a symposium on the challenge of the city. This symposium, in turn, is the first in a series of academic events to be sponsored by the college leading up to the observance of its centennial in 1969. We are very pleased indeed this evening to be able to sponsor the lecture that is to be given by Dr. Dyckman, because we are convinced that the topic is of the greatest importance to us as a college set in the midst of a rapidly changing metropolitan environment, and also because it speaks directly to one of the immediately pressing issues of our time. It is an honor for us to have Dr. John W. Dyckman as our speaker tonight, for he is recognized throughout the length and breadth of our land and in other nations as well as one of the leading authorities in the area of city planning. He was educated at Mount Carmel College in Niagara Falls, Ontario, Chicago Teachers College, and the University of Chicago, from which he earned his master's degree in economics in 1951 and his PhD in planning in 1957. At the present time, he is chairman of the Center for Planning and Development Research and professor of city and regional planning at the University of California in Berkeley. Before assuming his present duties, Dr. Dyckman had broad and impressive experience in the field of city planning. He was for a while chief of the Regional Development and Urban Economic Section, Arthur D. Little Incorporated, in San Francisco. Before that, he served as a member of the City Planning Department faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, being there for about 8 years. He has been visiting professor at Stanford University. He has been associated with the Illinois Institute of Technology, the Southside Planning Board in Chicago, and the Chicago Housing Authority. In addition to all this, he has served as consultant to a large number of agencies, including the New York City Planning Department, the Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago, the National Park Service, the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority, and so on. In addition to this, he has served a whole host of organizations in a consultative capacity. As you walked in this evening, you were handed some cards, some blank cards. The idea was that during the course of the lecture, there are some questions that you may want to jot down. At the conclusion of the lecture, the ushers will gather these cards and present them to Dr. Dyckman. The hope is that we can continue the discussion for a while after the lecture this evening. It is my privilege to present to you Dr. John W. Dyckman, who will address us this evening on the topic, The Changing Forces at Work in the City. Professor Dyckman.
Thank you, Mr. Senek, and ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. Ordinarily, I can be heard the length of the breadth of the land without benefit of microphone, and I would prefer to be able to speak to you without microphone tonight, but I've got some laryngeal complication picked up in Berkeley, undoubtedly, not out west, which makes it difficult for me to speak without the mic. So should it fail to get across at some time tonight, make little clapping noises or wave your hands in the back or something, and I'll try to up tempo or up volume a little bit. It's become very much a vogue among students, I've noted, in the University of California and perhaps elsewhere around the country in recent years, to clamor for more dialogue with the faculty, to clamor especially for something closer and closer to direct address or face-to-face dialogue. This makes it difficult for one to lecture with the customary aplomb and difficult also to do it unself-consciously to so large a gathering. I hope to overcome this a little bit this evening by asking you, if you will, to join with me in a kind of exercise in which you take on as much as I the burden of constructing a make-believe picture or a speculative one, which just might fold onto the real world and fit. Because it's also the mode in contemporary science not to be sure where the real world is and to make up models of it, which we hope might be useful. Traditionally, when one wanted to talk about a subject of the kind that I want to talk about tonight, he reached into history, because the convenient study of cities in the past has been historical. I think there are a couple of reasons for this, for the confidence of historians in treating the city. Cities are relatively fixed in two of the most important axes with which these models deal, namely space, and they're usually dated in time. And also, cities have been the repositories of much of the written record of any society that we know about, and they happen to be institutions which have been conveniently self-conscious and have kept their own records. But tonight, I'm going to ask that we make a more bold step. Instead of looking at cities historically, I would like you to accept a premise which I advance wholly on faith, that cities in all the technologically advanced societies of the world are undergoing rather dramatic change and are about to alter their recognizable identity. It is difficult, even for the historians, to explain why we have the cities we have in the form in which we find them. It is difficult, for example, to account for the particular shape, size, and relations between cities, or which one would find looking at the continental areas of the world. When one wishes to intervene in the city forming process, as does the city planner, or as would the city planner could he, if one wishes to redesign cities for new functions, then at that stage of the game, he finds that if there was one reliable causal explanation of why cities are the way we find them, that it would be worth a whole library of descriptions of cities. And forecasting a radical break with the past is a speculative exercise, not a scientific one. Bertrand Russell once observed that the question of evidence that causal laws have held in the past, in the observed portions of the past, should not be confused with the truth of causal laws in the future and in the unobserved portions of the past. And I think that when we look at cities, we are faced with the fact that we don't know much about these unobserved portions of the past, and we have only the most speculative views of the future. But I'm going to ask you today to join me in a very speculative view. I want to start with the idea that cities will change. Now, for Americans, this is not a difficult idea. It's much more difficult, let's say, for Western Europeans. Americans have an almost naive confidence in progress. Development and change are favorite concepts of the urbanist, and almost nobody complains about them in government and in our popular culture. If you say development, it's considered to be a good word. Virtually the entire literature on cities, from the annual reports of the civic boosters to the science fiction of the Sunday supplements, sees the city as a faithful companion of and a reflection of the inexorable progress of America. The change in our cities is part of the fact that American life is one unbroken line of progress. But in world history, this notion of progress is relatively modern. It was supported by Darwinian and post-Darwinian discoveries. And we forget that in the Darwinian formulation, progress was bought at the expense of some losers. Applied to all human society, these Darwinian notions are not all-inclusive or simplistic. The record of social progress is uneven, it's erratically spiraling, and it has many directions. And naive notions of progress, when applied to the city, have become their own caricatures. As a city planner or a city historian, one can easily find an abundance of city plans which have rather naively stated grandiose growth objectives for the city, which now are conveniently and mercifully stashed away by the ones which have not grown. The city as an institution is certainly changing, and since the change is so little directed, as we've admitted, by the planners, we may say that it's evolving. In the course of this change, some cities, far from progressing, are falling back. And more important for our purposes this evening, as our system of cities evolves, individual cities are changing their functional roles and importance. In the great culmination of the urban transformation of our society, which we may expect will reach its crescendo in the next 30 years, some important places of the 19th century will cease to be cities in the late 20th century sense. The 130 million or more urbanites whom we will probably welcome in this period will be enough to people 15 new cities of 200,000 people each year. But almost no one believes that there will be 650 new and distinct cities formed in America in that period. The city planners sometimes hope that this 130 million new urban growth could be conveniently located in new cities which they would design and build. But if the growth does not take the form of these new cities, it will have to swell the old ones. And as it does, we may expect some 15 or 20 metropolitan centers in the United States to grow to a point at which they are qualitatively different in almost every respect from the small historic places which we've been calling city in every part of the world for 1,000 years. If you'll join me for a moment in this speculation, I will argue that city scale is changing and that with it is changing the meaning of the word city. The town of 2,500, once recognized by the census as an urban place, is no longer urban at all if it is independent. If it's stuck in the middle of a metropolitan area and happens to have an accidental political identity, we may call it urban. Left alone, it scarcely can be called that. Indeed, I would say neither is the city of 200,000 in the perspective of this speculation, in which we will have some cities of 20 million. Some cities may still be important urban places in the smaller, less technically developed parts of the world, but not in the technologically advanced United States. Further, I will ask you to consider the proposition that our cities are increasingly becoming integrated into continental urban systems, and small places are being integrated into metropolitan areas, and that the technology will continue to intensify these interdependencies. Third, in the course of these changes, we may anticipate companionate changes in the spatial division of labor within the metropolitan areas, a process which may do considerable violence to our traditional political arrangements, especially to our residual Jeffersonianism and to our cherished concept of community. Finally, in these speculations about the facts of the matter, I will conjecture that the evolving urban system has made many places functionally interchangeable. It has created interrelations which bear little resemblance to our national geographic structure of federalism, and most radically has altered the functional meaning and reduced the political importance of place itself. Now let me expand these points a little bit. Now, mindful of Russell's caution, I will not attempt a complete explanation of the forces, which I'll roughly characterize as some drive for technological and economic rationalization of our environment. But rather, I'll ask you to enter the spirit of the speculation and to consider with me what might be done and what might need to be done to bring our political, social, and cultural institutions and our bureaucratic organizations into a more effective relation to these forces, if in fact they do work this way. For if we are to have an environment rationalized in accord with some explicit public purpose, we will need new city planning, new social planning, and I submit a new federalism. We're not prepared to digest any of these right away. The urban scene and the internal urban pattern, which forms the prototypical American city vignette, is based on the cities which rose with industrialization, with the railroads, and with European immigration. The dynamics of urbanism today are different. Industrialization has become post-industrialization, as Mumford predicted it would, with an emphasis on the application of the principles of industrial technique to communication, to knowledge use, and to automatic control processes. Manufacturing employment has ceased to grow, despite great advance in output, and despite the decline of employment in agriculture, in which, incidentally, the industrialization process is virtually completed in America. Within the metropolitan areas, the once dominant factory that straddled the town's riverfront and commanded the area of the company village, which usually huddled around it, has moved out to a more sprawling horizontal plant on a major expressway route at some distance from downtown. Railroad stations, which you may remember were once cathedral-like eminences in the city downtown, are being torn down for office buildings whose workers arrive by bus or by car. The centennial of your own college may be marking an end of an era. Minneapolis, which in 1850 was still a sleepy mill town in St. Anthony Falls, grew up with the railroads that were pushed west with the Civil War era and with the great promotional flurry that buccaneers like Jim Hill created along their alignments. A popular 1937 book on Minneapolis noted in the flyleaf that, and I quote, "Minneapolis is like a man in his late 30s. This was 1937, mind you. Minneapolis is like a man in his late 30s who made a tremendous success at 25. He is pugnacious, and his friends wonder where he's going next." This was in 1937. Well, today, it is making its way, that is Minneapolis, economically by the manufacture of communications and automatic control equipment. And I note with some interest, going through the pop magazines the last couple of years, that it's a leader in the introduction of modish British fashions to hip teenagers. But more important, its relations to the rest of the continent, which during this era have depended so heavily on the railroad, have been dramatically altered. When I leave here on the 4:10 flight to San Francisco tomorrow afternoon, I expect to be in Berkeley for dinner. It's widely recognized that the United States is today 5 hours wide and 2 hours deep by jet plane. The 130 million new urban dwellers of the next 30 years will find the continents shrunk still further. For those of them who are in the jet set of their time, a flight to Paris may take substantially less time than my flight to San Francisco tomorrow. But not all cities are on the main line of the jet system. In this respect, the jet system is more uncompromisingly express than railroads ever were. A half dozen jet airports monopolize the through flights in our continental system, and they become the hubs of the great bulk of the connecting flights. These jet ports have become effective centers of great megalopolitan complexes. The cosmopolitans of our society who belong to the jet set are more at home in any one of the jet cities than in any of the other cities. I wrote at some length about this in an article in Daedalus, and it was published in 1961, and later in a book called The Future Metropolis. I think that the observations I made then, 59 or 60, are even more true today. For if we look at the situation, the tracing of the monthly, weekly, or daily life cycle of the more mobile citizens of our country is shattering to our traditional sense of spatial community. There are many people who live in different regions of the country according to season. Within a metropolitan region, there are areas remarkably specialized by function. 2/3 of the professionals at the time of the 1960 census lived outside the city in the suburban ring. At the same time, there has been a great suburbanization of blue-collar work, with new factories moving to the suburbs so that there are blue-collar as well as white-collar suburbs, and the professionals in the outer ring journeying to work in the city each day pass blue-collar workers journeying out to their factories. Neither is exclusively linked to the older, smaller community. Both are members of more than one community. I'm not sorry to see the mill towns go. I'm not sorry to see this development, which is part of a general movement in the increase of freedom of choice in our society, but we also must recognize that in the course of purchasing this freedom of choice, we have bartered away many of the kinds of identifications with community which the sociologists and social workers and parish priests and ministers and local service workers cherished for so long. The headquarters functions of the nation's businesses are increasingly concentrated in one city in the United States, New York. I'm fond of telling people that New York built more office space, Manhattan built more office space in the period 1945 to 1960 than all the rest of the cities in the country put together, just and for the most part to house these headquarters functions. And the New York-Washington axis is a daily route of a great legal and administrative apparatus of government business. Or in California we say agribusiness government. Don't need that. The ties of these influentials with overseas business and government interests may be closer than those with great sections of the national state. Indeed, the very population of the United States is moving towards the perimeter of the country, reflecting our international world orientation. The great metropolitan belts of the nation stretch along the Atlantic seaboard, the Gulf Coast, the West Coast, and the Great Lakes. Much of the interior has actually declined in population. If the hinterland of Minneapolis is the Dakotas, Montana, and so on, it is the fastest shrinking hinterland of any city in the country. But government adjustments have lagged behind these functional shifts. The institutions of the national economy, the state-federal government structure, including the taxation system, and the lower and middle-class residential orbits are all out of phase with the traditional organization of our political nation and our state geographic lines. In short, the city system is being reorganized in space, and sometimes without regard to space, while our political system and our economic federalism remain fixed in space. This tendency is particularly strong in continental United States, where there is free mobility of people and goods between states and regions, if not always within metropolitan areas. The mobility of industry and population, of economic activity of all kinds, suggests that the efficiency system propelling this constant reorganization is regulated by some economic criteria. These economic motive forces are, however, by no means classical textbook efficiency cases. Political barriers and social forces, such as those motivating Negroes to leave the South, complicate the analysis. Yet these forces are worldwide and can be seen even in continental systems divided into national states rather than non-barrier federal states like the U.S. The organizing forces in the urban system are bringing unorganized elements under their control and into their spheres of influence on every continent. World Economic Organization, the business system, transportation and communication systems, and urban organization are examples of these tendencies. Urban agglomerations are spilling across old national borders in the same way they've spilled over state borders in the United States. If certain byproducts of this organizational tendency, such as urbanization, per capita income, and other indices, are mapped on some world map without regard for national boundaries, one is struck by the strong agglomerative tendencies which reflect the peaks of this pattern. The spine of Europe, for example, is a piece of Western Europe from Scandinavia bending slightly through England and up the Rhine into Italy. And almost all the urban development of Europe in the past 15 years has moved towards that spine. The unheralded but persistent establishment of linkages between points in these highly organized systems is establishing a world urban order. In Europe, with its tradition of centralized bureaucracy and regional dominance by primate cities, the principal resistance to the economic reorganization is encountered at the boundaries of national states. In the United States, on the other hand, state lines are relatively unimportant, and traditions of local government provide the greatest source of political resistance to economic and administrative rationalization. I would predict that the conflict between the special interests of local place and the market rationalizing forces of urban reorganization will reach a peak of conflict in the next 2 decades. Indeed, local resistance may be viewed as an effort to restructure the market terms, particularly in the market for publicly supplied goods and services. The small place in the metropolitan area, city, suburb, industrial enclave, or unincorporated area, serves many social political functions. I would not deny this. One of the most important of these is exclusion. In our studies of new community development in California, we found this desire for exclusiveness, real or fancied, based on class as well as ethnic lines, to be a major appeal of the new separate communities or new towns being built within metropolitan areas. Put it another way, people were buying into these, the idea that they were buying into something like what was called a country club district in the 20s, if you remember. In addition, the local place, if segregated, may give minorities a chance to influence public policy through the position of the local unit in the federal system. The structure of the system, national, state, or local, may allow for extra leverage for the well-situated local elite or for the small place government. In other words, minorities can get more leverage if they are represented or they can control a separate place in a federal-type system. And there are, of course, powerful social motives as well. The American political ideal includes the notion of government by the people as well as of and for the people. However little realized in practice, this ideal spills over into social relations. Americans like public participation as individuals. Undoubtedly, too, such participation confers social standing and identity on individuals who might otherwise be deprived of these distinctions by the economic conditions of their lives. In the classic American formulation, the large city is the enemy of such identification. Bigness leads to impersonality and ultimately to anomie. As cities grow larger, and this tendency has been marked, I would say, the tension between individual participation and the requirements of organizational efficiency will probably grow more acute. Public opinion polls show a surprising percentage of Americans even today who would like to live in small towns of the country. But presumably they would like to live there with all the comforts of the city, like the comic strip country doctors in red sports convertibles. From the viewpoint of the metropolitan problems, however, the fragmentation of communities can be disastrous, as can be seen in the range of concerns from air and water pollution to highway planning. We may anticipate, therefore, a bitter struggle for sovereignty over individual decisions of all kinds in the metropolitan areas of the United States. And I say this because I think that the technical efficiency conditions of large metropolitan agglomerations requires some centralized control, and this is in direct conflict with some of the desires which I've mentioned before for direct political participation by as many individuals as possible in the managing of government. Unfortunately, too, the alternative to political separatism, to self-determination and self-interest contain their own risks. The problem of achieving a mass democracy is exacerbated by the pressure for the further bureaucratization of local government as the government task becomes more technical. Technically competent planning agencies will be needed to meet the problems of efficient movement in these areas, efficient disposal of waste, including atmospheric waste, of insulation from environmental frictions, and of aesthetics in these great metropolitan agglomerations of 20 to 30 million persons. But these technical bureaucracies, on whom the mayors of our large cities are increasingly leaning as political buffers as well as technical advisors, can form a virtually impermeable layer between elected representatives and their mass constituencies. This development can produce a profound alteration of the very concept of representative government. If government by the people is a technical impossibility in a modern, complex metropolitan area, can government of the people be safeguarded? Many thoughtful observers have become alarmed at the great growth of administrative law, and especially of administrative discretion in the United States. And I say that as often as you create ad hoc special purpose authorities and agencies, you create the opportunity for a relatively arbitrary exercise of administrative discretion, under the guise usually of technical expertise. The danger in administrative law lies in the fact that our common law procedures have not anticipated it, and so they say nothing about it. As a result, there is too often inadequate redress from the consequences and findings of the administrative decision. It is no accident that a whole host of political and social scientists have suddenly discovered the ancient Scandinavian institution of the ombudsman. But this folksy institution is better situated to the smaller homogeneous communities than to the large. For the ombudsman must be close to the people, and in areas where the administrative jurisdiction necessarily spans millions of people of diverse characteristics and interests, the possibilities for such effective communication are reduced. Nevertheless, we may anticipate a proliferation of devices aimed at holding the line against the effective political disenfranchisement of citizens in the larger domain of administrative power. The citizens' councils of the poverty program are a faint, maybe somewhat feeble beginning. But as you know, United Auto Workers found it worthwhile to put about $1 million into the subsidization of indigenous citizens' representation, which would, on its own hand, be a counterweight to the officially selected citizens groups of the poverty program. And I anticipate a great deal more movements of this kind. There will be need of officially sanctioned but locally selected advocates before the bars of law and administration. I don't know how this can best be done. Erich Fromm suggests a kind of a system of congresses in which, say, 20,000 people can be sent to Washington for direct face-to-face confrontation with representatives and so on. Periodically, I somewhat not quite so sanguine about that. I'd like the idea, however, of officially turning funds over to the poor or the disadvantaged to be used for their own defense, because I think that they would find ways to spend the money advantageously. Maybe in a lobby for the disadvantaged. In fact, if the federal government gave them back enough money out of the income tax, let's say a negative tax, as Milton Friedman recommended, in other words, a positive payment to people who couldn't afford to pay the tax because they didn't have income, on the condition that they spend a certain part of that trying to influence legislatures, I think there would be a very radical development. As the growth of urban industrial society broke down the informal support system of the small towns and villages, organized social services emerged to pick up the pieces from some of the breakage of industrial society. But in a society in which the skill gaps are widening between the most skilled and the least skilled, and in which jobs based on mere willingness to work are shrinking, we must face the issue of guaranteeing income openly. Unless we're prepared to offer a much wider range of free public services, we cannot long postpone the emergence of the guaranteed minimum income principle in America. I think in a way the guaranteed income has some appeal because it doesn't involve handing out anything free to people but money. I'm reminded in this connection of a seminar I once gave in New Orleans to college deans from southern and southwestern universities, and I broached this subject of some of the free distribution of certain public goods, like public transit, which I've long recommended ought to be free to the poor. And one of the deans got me afterwards and said, or I guess he may have been president, he said, he was from, I guess, southwestern Louisiana. He said, when I was a boy in East Texas, he said, we had, I was in school in the WPA days. And he said the WPA provided free hot lunches all over to school children, part of the Depression spending programs. And he said we had a real 100% American fundamentalist principal in our school, and he said he'd be darned if the kids in his school were going to get the idea that anything came without work or that you were entitled to something for nothing. So each day, before the kid could pick up his lunch, he had to take a big rock from one corner of the schoolyard and carry it over and set it down in the other corner. Well, I think this is the kind of mythology that we have to overcome, that there is something sacred, something divine in carrying rocks around and useless work. What is sacred is, to me, is the sustenance and preservation of life. And if you want to give out goods for the sustenance and preservation of life, it seems to me to be quite as holy an activity as rock packing. And I don't want to see a society of symbolic rock packing. But the Great Society has posed some difficult issues for us and our traditional values. We will need social planning to deal with Great Society issues, and we will need social planning of the emerging urban areas long after a degree of economic security has been attained. In the past, social planning has been remedial, a response to the residual part of our capitalist economy, which has not continually improved itself, to quote an 18th century economist. In other words, social planning has arisen as the necessitous consequence of our own interventions, as in the case of the dislocatees from urban renewal and highway building and other public programs, and for the casualties of our private efficiency economy and those parts of the efficiency economy which weren't so efficient. In the future, I expect social planning to be turned more directly to societal issues. The insistent processes of agglomeration will produce problems worthy of the most delicate social planning activities. The surge of urban scale, the complexity of urban interdependencies, and the abundant frictions of urban life have profound personal consequences for many new urbanites. The density of urban living leads to the creation of personal defenses, most notably the devices for securing privacy. Now, privacy may be secured by depersonalization or by compartmentalization entirely in one's own person. Thus, the enemy observed by 19th century social historians is one pathological form. But that's a kind of involuntary privacy, that is Durkheim's enemy, an imposed privacy. While the incredible self-concern of the bystanders who watch murder and mayhem without intervening is another form, which we're coming on more frequently today. And yet, much of the city planning problem in high-density cities will arise out of the need to mediate accurately and carefully between the desire for privacy of the individuals and the requirements of social living. Surveys made by the Michigan Survey Research Center in the Detroit area found the desire for privacy to be at the root of the phenomenon of one worker in one car in the journey to work studies. Some workers responded to the survey saying they'd like to play their own radio program when they drove home. But chronic riders of New York subways will testify to the extraordinary encapsulation of the individual rider in rush hour traffic. ride a New York subway, and everybody's in a private world at rush hour. So there are many ways to respond to this, and some of them, as I say, border perilously on social pathology. The trade union movement of the 30s called for solidarity and worker comradeship. The civil rights movement and the peace movement of the 60s, which have inherited that mantle of radicalism, call for a face-to-face confrontation. The present-day radicals and bohemians in the colleges protest against their impending depersonalization. They wish to be rescued from some Kierkegaardian helplessness and to be ensconced in some fundamental I-thou relationship to a government which drafts them or a university which grades them. The most extraordinarily inventive social planning will be needed to provide such opportunities and any semblance of mass democracy in the technically proficient world of the 1980s. It's no wonder that the computer and its consequences have become favorite subjects for student caricatures, partly because the implications are so little understood and so much feared by the students. In the super metropolis of tomorrow, amenity planning must increasingly be added to social planning. In place of the traditional view of the settlement house, which sought cultural monism and the Americanization of the lifestyle of immigrants, we will need some careful planning for variety, which can be fitted into a modern functionalist federal state. Now, I'm not going to take a side on this, but some sociologists I know feel very strongly that we cannot afford cultural pluralism in America, that only cultural assimilation will permit us to avoid some of the grave frictions and separatisms of American life. I hope we can achieve some cultural pluralism in America without these frictions. It's a matter of one's judgments about human nature, I guess. I do, though, believe very strongly we will face a situation in which variety becomes a very valuable premium. We've recently seen the development also of special function cities, Miami, Las Vegas, Los Alamos, and all the rest. If the traditional all-purpose city of our tradition, as I say, is to have attraction in the future, there must be some reorganization of the urban and metropolitan ecology to provide within the city concentrated opportunities for the experience of some of the advantages of the special purpose cities. Now, fortunately, there are abundant opportunities for this reorganization. Virtually no new factories are being built in the central cities, a kind of segregation faintly reminiscent of the production segregation of the guilds of medieval cities, which produced concentrated centers, but applied to arts rather than crafts, has begun to emerge. In a few bohemian areas, usually fortuitously situated strips of relatively cheap urbanity on the fringe of major markets, like the Telegraph Avenue strip south of the Berkeley campus, there is an observable drift to medieval social arrangements as well. Unlike Ruskin and Morris, I do not envision any return, that is, at least on a broad scale, to this simpler state. But I do believe that much of the interior core of cities can be reclaimed for social purposes, for social pleasure, and for societal arts. This can be done, moreover, without the pretentiousness of a New York or Los Angeles art center. For art and cultural activity would be increasingly a growth industry in an affluent, urbanized America. Science has already become such an industry. Scientific learning has acquired for the public the aura of authority and desirability that was enjoyed by theology and scholasticism in the Middle Ages. And often, I submit, with the same authoritarian auspices. Education is such a growth industry. In California, the great rite de passage from adolescence to maturity is the college diploma. That's how we make adults in California. In fact, the whole public sector is growing. In the period from 1957 to 1962, 6 of every 10 jobs created were accountable to the public sector. At its growth edge, the American economy has already created remarkable functional specializations and concentrations in these industries and in these skills. The Los Angeles metropolitan area, supported in large measure by the aerospace complex, contains about a quarter of all the engineers and mathematicians listed in our national science registers in one metropolitan area, broadly. Industries enjoying monopoly positions or monopsony are relatively free to take out the profits or privilege in the form of locational luxuries. They can seek out the areas of climatic or cultural advantage, thereby reinforcing the drift to such areas. And we are moving toward a kind of psychic economy in which traditional economic measures may increasingly need to be set aside. With adequate social planning, this kind of economy offers opportunities for the full utilization of human resources. The idea that human capital production should be planned is a relatively recent one with economists, I might add. Some credit to this usually goes to Professor Schultz of Chicago. The idea that human capital is worth measuring and that it's interchangeable with other capital is attributable to my old teacher, Frank Knight at Chicago. But we are only now beginning to consider that the development of human capital may become our most important industry. It's not necessary that the social planning of the future take the form of the limitation of choice, as the dystopians have always expected that it would. We can invent sources of income for almost anything we consider socially worthwhile. In an unself-conscious way, we've done this for centuries, and anyway, we've come close to accepting this notion of guaranteed income. And we could, if we chose, allocate income by some interesting and ingenious lotteries. But more conventionally, we can enlist the population in an extraordinary number of city-building and city-improving tasks. For it would be the ultimate irony of the mass society if the great mobilization of individuals in enormous urban complexes would lead only to the impoverishment of their lives under an illusory promise of material and cultural advancement. People have come to the city from its pull as well as from the push of the areas left behind, though they've sometimes been disappointed in the transition. In the process, they've developed an inordinate and sometimes unhealthy affection for the life and the activity and the choices of the great urban places. They cling desperately to this variety despite the mounting evidence of physiological insult and psychological stress. The real test of a genuinely great society for an urbanist is to turn this stubborn affection into a source of advantage and delight. Thank you. One series of questions which says, how does the great society of LBJ fit into the pattern of change, promoting or inhibiting cities? And then, how does the college or multiversity affect change? The first one asked me to editorialize, and I'm always pleased to be opinionated. I think that thus far, we have seen too little of the Great Society program to be able to say very much about this. And from all indications, we'll be seeing even less until the international situation and the international posture of the United States is clarified. But I will say this about the LBJ program. One of the features of the program, the Demonstration Cities program, recognizes two aspects of the problems that I discussed tonight. One, it recognizes the aspects that the federal government is dealing in a functional, individual way right now with all kinds of ad hoc problems and ad hoc agency in the city, and that it is sometimes offsetting its own good intentions by doing this. And so there is a need, a recognized need in Washington to clarify, to coordinate, and to somehow make more long-range sense out of this. This is very much, like the distinction in performance budgeting in the Department of Defense between efficiency and effectiveness. We have had individual agency efficiency without any effectiveness. And what this says is that effectiveness, this kind of a step, recognizes that effectiveness requires a statement of a generalized goal. Secondly, I think it's clear, if one looks at this situation, that the federal government has been trying to push towards a kind of metropolitan organization informally for some time. At first through the requirement that highway planning in metropolitan areas go through some test of coordination with the metropolitan plan, but incidentally also through this implied requirement that there will now be some federal coordination of these demonstration programs. But thus far, the federal government has done nothing directly, and I'm not sure that it can or would have the determination to do it, and I'm not sure that if it did it, it would do it well. With all those qualifications, I say they recognize the problem. Finally, how does the college or multiversity affect change? Well, a multiversity isn't making change, it's reflecting change. A university, a big state university, which is part and parcel of the business, including the agricultural business complex of the society, is not making change. It's recognizing that business has become very big, that business has become very dependent on science and research, that science and research is increasingly full of these external advantages, that is, it benefits all the businesses, and of the fact especially that the government is paying for 85% of all the research that business uses. And when you put those two things together, it's very clear that the old lines between the separate estates is no longer so clear, and the universities are reflecting the lack of clear distinction between these estates, the estate of government and business and so on. And it's a part of our American life about which you may or may not be happy, and which you may wish to change, and if you do wish to change it, I think as a society, you could perhaps mount a movement to return to some more primitive capitalism. I don't think we will find it easy going. Another question which I have here says, do you envision a post-scientific era? And the answer is, of course, because my imagination is virtually boundless. But seriously, I think that the big recognition of a post-scientific era will come about when we begin to end the split of the two cultures. I say we will be in a post-scientific era when the artists have at their command a vocabulary and a technique as simple, powerful, and understandable as that of the scientists. When they do, I think we'll be in a post-scientific era. Another question says, what is the effect of war and international conditions on city change? Well, my answer to that is that wars have, in fact, in the past, changed the relations between cities, but they've almost never destroyed the life of cities which grew to be over 500,000. Modern wars could do that. But wars in the past have not. The only city which ever grew to be of any size that was greatly affected by the World War II was Vienna. And Vienna survives in spite of the incredible development that its entire hinterland was sort of parceled out after World War II. Now, if you ask what's the effect of war by the United States in the contemporary world on our programs for urban development, I can say to you that they're obvious. The Vietnam War, which is increasingly escalating, the Vietnam War has practically finished the urban program for the next couple of years. But that has to do with the internal budget considerations of the federal government, not with any natural law. Another one says, what form do you see this federalism, the new federalism, taking? And that's a whole lecture, and takes a very long evening. I've already suggested some aspects of it, but I think, first of all, that the federalism will start out by taking advantage of something which already exists, namely functional relationships which are widely recognized. To be explicit and to give but one example, if you look at a metropolitan area, people now recognize that some of the functions which I mentioned can only be dealt with at a metropolitan level. Nobody believes seriously that a problem of water pollution, for example, in the Mississippi at St. Louis can be handled by the city of St. Louis. Everyone recognizes that's a broad metropolitan function and even crossing state lines and so on. All right, I submit that the first efforts at the new federalism will take advantage of this recognition, and we will get special purpose, special function governments organized to perform these functions. I hope we will not get a proliferation of additional authorities and agencies, which is what I was saying earlier. I hope instead we will have political responsibility. And if we have metropolitan governments elected to handle just those issues, elected either by the component cities or by the population at large or by some combination of the component cities and a population at large, if we can have some such package to deal with a problem and to surrender sovereignty of the individual communities over that problem, then I believe we have something effective in the way of a beginning of new federalism. The next question says, in view of the difficulty in coping with city problems today, how will we train people to manage 20 million population cities? Well, I don't know how we will train people. I know very little about training people. I think if we start out to train them, it'll be disastrous, so we may have to educate them instead. And we may have to educate them and allow them a certain amount of improvisation in the field, or latitude for improvisation. I suspect that the problem in any event of handling cities of 20 to 30 million people is not training them, because if we can train them, we can get them to do anything we need to do. The problem is, how do we manage them without training them? That's the hard problem. That's the educative problem. It's still coming. one says, what conditions, natural or created, will make possible independent new towns? Well, the conditions of independent new towns that I would set on these new towns is, first of all, that they be very big new towns. If we could mobilize the resources and the will and the intention to build a new town of 500,000 or more, it might succeed in being just that, a new town. If we build cities of 200,000 or less, the people will just gradually drift from the big cities where the action is. And on this I'm quite confident. Or if we build cities of 200,000, that scale, they will have to attach themselves as kind of dormitories or special purpose function, special function appendages of the big city to survive. Another question says, must we all end up living in New York cities if we can keep cities of a smaller size by curtailing freeways, mass transit, and forced decentralization of new cities? I partly answered that. I don't think any curtailing of freeways really had anything to do with it. As a matter of fact, if you really wanted smaller cities, you'd build all freeways. You'd build a network of freeways such as we've never seen. There are some people who say, that Los Angeles isn't a city, it's a lot of little cities. I don't believe that, but in a way, it's a step in that direction. If you really want a lot of smaller-sized communities, build a gigantic, enormous freeway network and let it have no central place and and make it such that no one can find his way through it very far at a time. Why do you dwell so on the guaranteed income? Oh, it's nostalgia for an era when I won't have to work. Thank you.
Well, again, we thank you very, very much. Let me simply, in conclusion, invite you to attend the third session in this symposium tomorrow morning, beginning at 9:45 here in the same place, at which session the mayor of our fair town, the Honorable Arthur Naftalen, will address us on the question, the problem of the crisis in urban government.